Hi, I'm Brad Newcombe, and welcome to Pressure Point. We hear and see on our television screens ongoing stories of violence from South Africa. How do we, from our Canadian vantage point, get behind these news reports? The best way would be to go to South Africa itself, and my two guests did just that last summer. I'm happy to have with me Reverend Karen McCandless-Davis and Bruce McAndless-Davis. Karen, you're a Presbyterian minister at St. Andrew's Newton in Surrey, and Bruce, you are a third-year theological student at Vancouver School of Theology.
Right.
Welcome to both of you. Good
Thank
to have
you.
you. And just before we get into the questioning, just like to say that throughout the show there will be slides that will appear on the screen, and the two of you took these slides in South Africa?
Yep.
Okay. Let's start. How did you get to South Africa? I mean, a long way from being minister in Surrey and a student out at UBC campus at VST.
Well, the Presbyterian Church in Canada every year sends a couple of students overseas to work with our partner churches, and so I was given that opportunity this past summer to be one of those people, and I was sent to work with our partners in Southern Africa.
Okay. And Karen, were you involved in the same project, different project? What was your role there?
Yeah. Well, I joined Bruce for 6 weeks of the summer, and I went on a study leave to interview and observe women in that country, particularly Black Christian leaders in the country, to see how they were functioning in their church.
Okay, we'll come back a little more specifically to the work the two of you did. But where were you located?
We were mostly in Johannesburg. We were living in a white suburb of Johannesburg, and then in the days we would go into some of the townships to visit and work and observe what was going on.
Now, did you also get the chance to travel around the country, or were you really sort of located primarily in Johannesburg?
We spent most of our time in Johannesburg living there, but we did get to visit a few other places like Durban. We got into the countryside a little bit. We also got into the country of Lesotho and visited Mozambique for a short time as well.
One of the good excursions was to Durban, which is a city on the coast, a beautiful city, that the South African Council of Churches had their annual meeting there this past year. So we were able to be there for the annual meeting, and that was a really good experience too.
Now, I understand that the church you worked with, has a black congregation. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that was not located in this white suburb, obviously, in Johannesburg. So what was your daily life like if you wake up in the morning in a white suburb in Johannesburg and you go to work in a black township? And where was it?
We lived in a beautiful big home, bigger than our own here, in a nice part of Johannesburg. But each day we would go into the township of Alexandra most of the time, which was pretty much surrounded by the city. But really was like a different world to just cross over a road and go into a community that was obviously very different from...
Now, paint a picture for me. How different? I mean, I've never been to South Africa.
It was
paint
like
these two worlds
for
me.
It was like traveling from the first world to the third world. I mean, the white suburbs is exactly like our own here. It has garbage collection and electricity and all the rest. And you would go on the highway and veer off into Alexandra Township, and all of a sudden you would be on Pot Road. Most shacks did not have electricity or running water or whatever, and it was, both of us have been in the third world, it was the same experience.
Garbage all over the streets, children kind of playing, it was...
Now, and
it was ugly.
Do you just go straight in? I mean, or is that sort of a common route for people to travel, or do a lot of white people and black people go back and forth? I mean,
the black people come into the city and the suburbs to work, but white people do not go into the townships, and we met on various occasions white people that were about our age, students in some university or whatever, that had never been into a township, and this is right beside their city.
Well, it's interesting, the only white people that do go into townships are ministers, policemen, and doctors. And in the case of doctors and policemen, the reaction you get from children often, if you're a white person, is they're afraid of you because you're either going to give them a shot or you're a policeman who is not very welcome.
So once in a while we had little children running away from us and their parents would tell us that they thought we were either doctors or police. But I mean, most people's response to us was very open because they knew that we were with the church, and that really opened a lot of doors for us.
Would there be any sense of danger when you were traveling back and forth?
Well, there's most townships in South Africa are plagued by violence that's sometimes quite random, so you need to be careful and know where you're going and be sort of very direct about getting there. It's not a place where you sort of take a casual walk, but generally if you're with people as we were that you trust and know the area and are known by the community, it's quite okay.
Wearing a clergy shirt or something, some way of identifying yourself as being with the church frees you up.
Right, of course, that would make you different than a doctor or a police officer.
Yeah.
Now I mentioned at the introduction that we do hear and see ongoing stories of violence from South Africa. It seems to be never ending. Did you encounter firsthand reports from people you knew of violence?
Well, certainly there were stories all the time. We visited people who had been victimized themselves, or every black person at least in South Africa, I think, has had their family touched by the violence in some way or another. It's on a weekly basis, hundreds of people are killed. In fact, it's worse now than it ever was in the late 1980s when the state of emergency was on. The situation of violence is very serious.
Why so? Why is it worse now?
Well, I'm not sure. I think partly because there's sort of less control being exerted in a direct sense, which means that the more dangerous elements are able to operate freely in their attacks. Political organizations that...
And again, now you say the more dangerous elements are able to operate more freely. Who are the more dangerous elements?
Well, in particular, the Inkatha Freedom Party is a political party that has been supported by the South African government, the police and security forces in arming them and in training them to conduct sort of destabilization in black communities. Basically, they create an impression, anyway, of ungovernability, of chaos, so that the white government has the excuse of maintaining power, their own power, and not giving way to democracy.
Now, we do hear stories about black groups fighting with black groups as well. I mean, that the conflict, in a sense, has expanded, I suppose, in a very broad way, so that it is no longer sort of white versus black, but there's...
Yeah, it's becoming a more complicated situation, and I think it's more difficult for us to discern what's going on. But I guess I saw two things happening around that issue, is that there are legitimate differences between different black groups. When colonialism came into Africa, it put together different nations of people and has forced them to live together when they have different languages and cultures and different interests and different ways of wanting to be governed and so on. So there are some legitimate differences there that need to be worked out. And so, black people do not all think the same way, in the same way that French Canadians and English Canadians don't always think the same way. And as we see in Eastern Europe, there are differences of opinions and struggles and so on. And yet we don't call those kind of things, being white on white violence, and yet people look at South Africa and say there's black on black violence here. So there are legitimate differences that are trying to be worked out. But those things have been aggravated by the government and by other interests that are trying to destabilize them and not allow them to move forward.
I think it's fair to say that most of the violence that exists is political rather than ethnic or tribal in nature. Okay,
and now define political. What do you mean by political? I mean, because again, you've just mentioned there's various factions within various black communities, perhaps even nations, and at the same time, then there's also white minority
political
rule.
In the sense of different people trying to gain power. My analysis is, and I think this is shared by many of our church partners, that it's particularly one group, for the most part, that has a fairly small power base, the Inkatha Freedom Party, that is trying to expand its power base wider, and the way they do that is by moving in and really terrorizing communities into giving in to their own power demands.
Now, how do you, like, again, we only get a very limited kind of perception of South Africa from this vantage point. You had the chance to be there for a summer and for 6 weeks. How do we get behind and sort of understand the nuances and the kind of complicated nature of these struggles? Can you?
Well, I think our best source, particularly those of us that are involved in the church here, is to be in touch as closely as possible with our church partners in Southern Africa. They are on the ground working with their people on a daily basis. They know what's going on, and they're a trustworthy source of information. And they can help us cut through a lot of the either simplistic or misleading information that we receive through the mainstream media.
Did you have many experiences yourself of having your minds changed, or some tremendously new insights or something from your experience in South Africa?
Well, I guess something that I really realized is I'd heard a lot about South Africa and always had the impression that these white people here were so horrible to keep 80% of their population or whatever in such a state. And yet, being in South Africa, I began to realize that we're very similar in this country as well. You know, as a white person, my family immigrated here. That land has been taken away from a native population, and they've been moved to reserves or to homelands and so on. I learned that some of the South African government's policies in their treatment of black people came actually from Canada and its treatment of native people, that there's a connection there that they learned from us. And so it affected the way that I look at my own country and as a citizen here, and what should my relationship be to native people, and that some things need to be sorted out there as well.
And you learned that about Canada in South Africa?
Yeah, I sort of needed that perspective to go there, and part of it was talking to white people in South Africa and hearing them say the same things about black people that I hear people here talk about native people. You know, that this idea that the black people were trying to get something for nothing, that that the white people had built out this wonderful nation, and now the black people were trying to grab it back. And I just thought, I've heard this kind of stuff before, and it made me reflect on our own situation, I think.
So did that affect the way you come back to Canada, to how you come back, what you see as your involvement in our own country?
Well, it makes it a lot harder to be complacent about our role here and to simply condemn something that's far away. It forces us, I think, to become involved and informed about the conditions that exist for people in our own country. That injustice is not something that happens far away, but it happens right on our doorstep in our own communities.
And certainly that often it's very easy to point the finger at other places, particularly when you can often sort of judge the situation in stereotypes and maybe quick and easy solutions and so on, whereas, we always find it, a little grayer, a little murkier in our own backyard, because we're, of course, all involved.
Now, the most refreshing thing, though, about my experience in South Africa was the graciousness of the people that we encountered. We were at many events where memorial services or times when the horrible things that were happening were recounted, the stories of land being taken away, of churches being taken away from people. And so, there'd be perfectly good reason for a lot of anger being directed at white people, and yet the graciousness and welcome with which we were received.
Now, I know
was
about land
phenomenal.
being taken away. I've heard of land being taken away, but churches, why would a church be taken away?
Well, the church that we worked with mostly in Alexandra, the township of Alexandra is very close to the city of Johannesburg, and the government wanted to close down the township because it was too close to the city, and they said they wanted to get rid of the black spot, as they said. So they wanted to remove that township, and so they forced people to sell their land, including the church, and the church was forced to sell its land at a much reduced rate. But the people refused to move, and there were a lot of protests and so on, and the people continued to worship in this church in Alexandra. And for 20 years they did that. They didn't own the church, but they continued to worship there, and it started to crumble and fall apart because they didn't put any repairs into it and so on. But just within the last few years, with some of the shifts and things, the government sort of gave up on closing Alexandra and allowed the people to buy it back at an inflated rate, and they had to raise a lot of money, but they bought the church back. And just this summer, while Bruce and I were there, they completed the church building and reopened it. And they had a big celebration And lots of people came. It was a really joyful time of sort of reclaiming who they were as a people and their home.
Sure.
Because they fought really hard to keep Alexandra. What they wanted to do was to keep the men there so they could be close to the city and work, but to remove the women and children. And they wanted it to stay a family community where people could live together.
And that's the neat thing about Alexandra. When I told you about my first impressions, you walk in and obviously the living conditions are horrible, and you go, people shouldn't have to live this way. And yet Alexandra, by its very existence, is also a sign of great victory, because they have kept it a family community, which the government was determined for so much time to remove it as a family community. So the thing you learn when you go to South Africa is that things are not simple. It's the simple images that you get by the media or whatever, the stories you hear, there's so much more behind them, and it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to meet some of the people and make friends. And
there's a lot of joy and hope in the midst of all the struggle too.
So that, it brings people together. And certainly you would have a very different perspective by being able to work and meet people in South Africa as opposed to sort of the white tour groups and so on.
Yeah, we did a couple of white touristy things, and we're amazed at the impression that people can be given by going to that country. We went on a tourist excursion to an old gold mine and went down into the mine and listened to the tour guide tell about how this was a good profession for black people. And yet we'd heard the other side of the story, how men were left their families to go work in the mine and didn't see their families very often, were not paid well at all, and were worked in cramped and unhealthy conditions and so on. And so you can get two very different impressions, I think, by going to the country.
Karen, your project was to work with black women, and specifically, what were you doing, and what are some of the conditions and issues for black women in South Africa?
Yeah. Well, I went to go and learn from them about what they were doing, and I interviewed women at three different levels, really. I interviewed women in the local parish to see what they were doing, and were impressed by their dedication. They're very hardworking. That typically women in a township would have really two full-time jobs. They would be taking care of their family and their home. Their husband may be away working somewhere else, and they worry about their kids and all the violence. One of their big concerns is they send their kids out to school every day and don't know if their kids are going to come home, and so that's a real burden on them. And then many of them also have to work to provide for the family, and so they work as a domestic in someone's home. That's a very common profession. And working can mean working every day of the week. Sometimes people work both Saturday and Sunday. And then they're also dedicated to their church and work hard in fundraising and Christian education and so on. So I was really inspired by them. And I also interviewed some women clergy, and many of the mainline denominations are starting to ordain women there. While we were there, the Anglican Church voted to start to do that, so that was a new move on the Anglicans' part. And I also interviewed some of the women that worked on a national level for the South African Council of Churches, and they were very dynamic and committed, and inspiring too in a way that they helped me to think about what, as a woman, can I offer the church? Because that was the question they were asking. They didn't want to step into a sort of a man's role and do it the way it's always been done, but they were asking what different things, what unique things can women offer to the church? And I think that's a question that I want to be asking here in Canada as well. And one of the women said, Karen, the first people to the tomb were women, and they were the first ones to proclaim new life. And she said, what can women do now? What firsts can they do now to proclaim new life? And that's the kind of questions that some of the women are asking in South Africa. And at times I got the sense that they were sort of ahead of us in that kind of thinking.
Wonderful experience for you.
Yeah.
To be able to bring that back also, how it sort of molds your own thinking and questioning, and bring that back and share it with women and men here.
Yeah. I think their courage inspired me, to get up and say what needs to be said and those kinds of things. Yeah.
The Soweto uprising, June 16th, 1976, a number of black children were murdered during protests, and of course that is remembered every year. I know that you were in Soweto on June 16th last year. What was it like to be a white person at remembrance of the murder of so many black children?
Well, it was fascinating. I was surprised to discover that, I guess, with this kind of distance from that event, it was less a mournful exercise, although certainly the funerals that happen now are. But it was really an almost defiant mood. So I was a little scared at first. Soweto was not a place I spent a lot of time in. But as I met some of the people, the organizers were mutual friends, I realized, people have learned to a tremendous extent how little color matters, and that white or black doesn't necessarily mean your friend or foe. So it was a marvelous experience, and I got to see Nelson Mandela there. He was unveiling a memorial stone that was dedicated to Hector Peterson, who was the first black child killed in '76. So it was quite an experience to be part of a community's remembering of an event, but also looking forward to a better future.
And Nelson Mandela, just may say a few words about seeing him and his presence and role in the community.
He was, he was wearing a New York Yankees cap. I wish I'd had a Blue Jays cap to give him, but and wearing just a sweatshirt. I think he was really showing himself to be a man of the people, and certainly he is respected in that way. We often see him on television looking like quite a statesman, and he is that as well. But it's neat to see. I mean, he's a really grandfatherly kind of person. He took an awful long time to come through the crowds because he's so anxious to talk to people and be with them. But it's interesting because the African National Congress, of course, is now making the transition from being a liberation movement into being a political party. So you see them acting in sort of more stereotypically like politicians, with all of the complications that involves, and really some of the ambiguities around that as well.
Which would be interesting to talk to Nelson Mandela himself and find out how he's, adjusting to that shift for himself as well. One issue in his life and in South Africa, we've seen a lot of reports from Winnie Mandela and the many troubles and criminal charges and so on. And she said it's not just their own personal problems. How has Winnie Mandela's troubles impacted upon Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa?
Well, it's interesting. I think Nelson himself was, on a personal level, very loyal to her right up until her conviction, after which she sort of faded out of the picture. They've been estranged now for quite some time. Winnie is identified still as an important leader by some elements of the African National Congress. I think particularly the more radical young people see her as someone that they look to for leadership, but really she's out of favor, of course, with the mainstream, and I think it's been interesting because Nelson Mandela himself has managed to, despite his initial loyalty, to maintain his own integrity in the eyes of most people, despite his association with his wife. Of course, many of the things that she's charged with happened while he was still in jail, and so that he's really not touched by that criminal activity.
But also, I'm sure, the personal pain as well. I mean, there would be tremendous personal pain in all of this.
Well, it's interesting. You see them getting together now, and they'll still hug and kiss and say hello to each other, but it's like they're sort of distant friends now rather than husband and wife.
I understand that you heard Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, preach.
Bruce did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry you weren't there for that. It was
good preacher?
An amazing preacher. He is so animated and so dynamic. I heard him preach at a mass funeral where there was over 50,000 people there. It was a funeral for victims of the Boy Patung massacre, which happened just after the June 16th event, where over 40 people were killed one night by members of the Inkatha Freedom Party. And to hear him preach in the midst of what was really a very angry crowd. People are obviously angry about the violence that goes on, but for him to really bring us back down to earth and talk about the basics of apartheid and why this is evil and what we need to do to overcome the terrible evil of apartheid. Still, we've heard a lot about the reforms in the last 2 or 3 years, about the pillars of apartheid being gone. Our experience, I think, was that apartheid still remains very much in place for the majority of people in South Africa, and
for all practical purposes, you mean?
Yeah.
Certainly.
Oh,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah, yeah. And there's a need for reconciliation. Do you remember Desmond Tutu told the illustration about the pen?
Well, it's interesting. I learned a theological thing that day. He held out a pen and said, you know, it's very hard for me to forgive you if you come to me and say, I'm sorry I took your pen, but my pen is still in your pocket. But if you hand me my pen back and say, I'm sorry I took your pen, it's very easy for me to forgive you. Mm-hmm. And the point he was making, of course, was that you don't just apologize for apartheid without making restitution, mm-hmm. that apartheid is evil and to recognize that is good, but if you still hold all the privileges that come with apartheid and say that apartheid is dead, well then there can be no reconciliation then.
And it doesn't really mean all that much.
No.
There is an organization here in Canada, it's the Interchurch Coalition on Africa.
Yes.
And so the name and phone number and address in Toronto.
Yeah, they funnel all kinds of information and even participate in educational events here in Canada. And so if you're interested in finding more information about what's going on in Southern Africa, in fact all of Africa, there's the Interchurch Coalition on Africa can help you do that, so I'd encourage people to call them.
And of course there is a lot of tension in Africa and not an easy continent to understand. We don't have a lot of time left, but I know that you also went to Lesotho mm-hmm. and to Mozambique. Mm-hmm. Briefly, can you describe something about Mozambique, a country that is considered to be the world's poorest and mm-hmm. has been scene of civil war, torture, mm-hmm. and so on? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for 20 years, the people of Mozambique have been victim to Renamo, which have been guerrillas that have terrorized people, and so the country's left in a lot of poverty, tons and tons of orphans, and just overwhelming problems.
What about the peace accord? Is that holding?
The information we have now is that it really has taken effect, and that people are starting to move back out into the countryside that they had fled, that it's becoming safe now mm-hmm. to travel.
So there's some hope there too, but it's a long way back for the country.
That was in late 1992. Mm-hmm. We have to go, but it's been a pleasure talking to you and hearing your stories from Southern Africa.
Well, thank you very much, Brad.
I've been talking with Bruce and Karen McCandless-Davis on their summer of 1992 in Southern Africa. Thanks for watching Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.